They told me the overnight shift at the abandoned grain elevator would be easy work. Monitor the equipment, check the moisture readings twice per shift, and make sure nobody breaks into steel copper wire. What they didn't tell me was why the previous security guard lasted only 11 days. What they didn't mention was the sound that starts exactly at 2:47 a.m. every single night. I'd been teaching high school chemistry for 6 years when the budget cuts hit Jefferson County. Pink slips went out on a Friday in March, and mine was in the stack. Program restructuring, they called it. I spent the weekend grading lab reports I'd never hand back, packing up equipment I'd organized myself, watching my classroom get marked with yellow tape like a crime scene. By Monday morning, I was unemployed with a mortgage payment due in 3 weeks and enough savings to maybe cover it once. The divorce had been finalized the month before. Sarah kept the house in Millerville. I kept the debt and a studio apartment that smelled like industrial carpet cleaner. She'd stopped asking if I needed help the day the papers were signed. I stopped pretending I had my life figured out around the same time. The teaching job had been my anchor, the thing that made me feel like I was contributing something meaningful to the world. Without it, I was just a 37-year-old man with a chemistry degree and no clear path forward. I needed work that would let me disappear for a while, something where I could think without anyone asking me about 5-year plans or career goals. If you've ever had to start over when you thought you had everything figured out, you'll understand what comes next. That's how I ended up responding to a classified ad in the Millerville Herald that was exactly 4 lines long. Security position available. Night shift. Agricultural facility. $18 per hour. Must be comfortable working alone. The phone number connected me to a woman named Dorothy Chen who asked if I could start immediately and whether I had any issues with rural locations. I told her no on both counts. She gave me an address on County Road 47 and told me to meet her there at sunset. The grain elevator sat on 43 acres of farmland that had been sold to Meridian Agricultural Holdings 2 years earlier. Dorothy explained this while walking me through what she called the facility perimeter as the sun dropped behind a line of oak trees that looked older than the county itself. The elevator was a concrete tower that rose about 80 feet into the sky, flanked by a series of metal storage silos and connected by a network of conveyors and loading equipment that hadn't operated since the previous harvest season. The equipment is worth more than the land, Dorothy said, handing me a key ring with 7 keys on it, which is why we need someone here overnight. Thieves target copper wiring, aluminum components, anything they can strip out and sell for scrap. Your job is to make sure that doesn't happen. She showed me the security trailer, which was positioned about 30 yards from the main elevator. It contained a desk, a folding chair, a space heater, and monitoring equipment connected to sensors throughout the facility. The sensors track temperature, humidity, and something Dorothy referred to as structural movement, without explaining what that meant. She handed me a clipboard with a log sheet and told me to record readings every 2 hours. The important thing, she said, checking her watch, is that you follow the procedures exactly as written. No exceptions, no improvisation. The previous guard had problems with that. I asked what kind of problems. Dorothy looked at the grain elevator, then back at me. He decided the rules didn't apply to him. That's why we're having this conversation. Have you ever taken a job where the warnings felt more important than the actual work? Let me know in the comments, because what Dorothy told me next changed everything. She produced a manila folder from her briefcase and opened it to reveal a single sheet of paper with 8 numbered rules typed in courier font. The paper looked like it had been photocopied multiple times, with slightly blurred edges and that distinctive gray tint that comes from feeding the same document through an office machine over and over. Rule 1, she read aloud. Remain in the security trailer between 10 p.m. and 6 a.m. unless conducting hourly perimeter checks or responding to sensor alerts. Rule 2. During perimeter checks, carry the provided flashlight at all times. Do not use personal lighting equipment. Rule 3. If you observe lights inside the grain elevator between midnight and 4 a.m., record the observation in the log, but do not investigate. Rule 4. The elevator's main entrance is equipped with magnetic locks. Do not attempt to override these locks under any circumstances. Rule 5. If you hear machinery operating inside the facility after hours, assume it is automated maintenance and continue normal duties. She paused and looked up at me. Are you following this? I nodded, though I was wondering why a decommissioned grain elevator would have automated maintenance running at night. Dorothy continued reading. Rule 6. The service road gate closes automatically at 9 p.m. and reopens at 7 a.m. Do not leave the facility during your shift unless you have emergency authorization from facility management. Rule 7. In case of equipment malfunction or sensor failure, contact the emergency line immediately. Do not attempt repairs yourself. Rule 8. At the end of each shift, secure all equipment, lock the trailer, and place the completed log sheet in the designated drop box. Dorothy folded the paper and handed it to me. Questions? I had several, but something about her tone suggested she was more interested in compliance than clarification. What happened to the previous guard? He violated Rule 4, she said. Among others, the sun had disappeared behind the tree lean, and the facility was beginning to look different in the twilight. The grain elevator cast a long shadow across the service road, and I could hear wind moving through the metal framework of the conveyors. Dorothy walked me back to the security trailer and showed me how to operate the monitoring equipment. 3 screens displayed sensor readings from different areas of the facility. Green numbers meant normal conditions. Yellow meant attention required. Red meant immediate response necessary. The system logs everything automatically, she explained. But you still need to record manual readings in the paper log. Redundancy is important in facilities like this. I asked what made this facility different from others. Dorothy was already walking toward her car, a black sedan parked near the main gate. Call the emergency line if you need anything, she said without answering my question. And Marcus? She turned back toward me. The rules exist for good reasons. Follow them. Her headlights swept across the trailer as she drove away, leaving me alone with 43 acres of agricultural equipment and a set of rules that felt more like warnings than procedures. I spent the first hour familiarizing myself with the monitoring equipment and reading through the log entries from previous shifts. Most were routine: temperature readings, humidity levels, equipment status checks. But starting about 2 weeks earlier, I noticed entries that were different. 2:47 a.m., sound from elevator, duration approximate 4 minutes, appeared in 4 different logs. Lights visible on level 3, no investigation per Rule 3, showed up twice. The most recent entry, from 3 days ago, simply read, unable to complete 3 a.m. perimeter check. Gate malfunction. If this story is keeping you hooked, a quick like helps more people discover mysteries like this one. I decided to start with a baseline understanding of what normal looked like. The facility had motion sensors in the main elevator, temperature monitors in each storage silo, and what the system labeled as acoustic sensors positioned throughout the complex. At 11 p.m., everything showed green. Temperature readings were consistent with the October weather, motion sensors showed no activity, and the acoustic sensors registered normal background levels. At midnight, I conducted my first perimeter check. The rules specified a clockwise route starting from the security trailer, moving along the fence line, checking each building entrance, and returning to the starting point. Total distance was approximately half a mile. I carried the provided flashlight, which was heavier than it looked and produced a distinctly bright, white beam that seemed to illuminate more than it should. The grain elevator looked different at night. During my orientation with Dorothy, it had seemed like any other piece of agricultural infrastructure. In the darkness, with my flashlight beam moving across its concrete surface, it felt more like a monument or a lighthouse. The main entrance was secured with the magnetic locks Dorothy had mentioned, and I could hear a low humming sound that I assumed was the electrical system maintaining the locking mechanism. I completed the perimeter check without incident and returned to the trailer to log the results. Everything remained green on the monitoring screens. I made coffee using an electric kettle I'd brought from my apartment and settled in to wait for the 2 a.m. check. That's when I heard it for the first time. At exactly 2:47 a.m., a sound began emanating from inside the grain elevator. It wasn't machinery. It wasn't wind moving through the structure. It was rhythmic, metallic, and it seemed to be coming from somewhere high in the facility. I watched the acoustic sensors jump from green to yellow, then stabilize at a level that suggested significant noise, but nothing that triggered an emergency alert. The sound continued for 3 minutes and 42 seconds, then stopped as abruptly as it had begun. The acoustic sensors returned to green. I recorded the observation in the log, noting the exact time and duration, and tried to convince myself it was some kind of automated process I didn't understand. The rest of the shift passed without incident. Dorothy arrived at 7 a.m. to collect the log and ask if I'd had any problems. I mentioned the sound from the elevator. She nodded like she'd been expecting this. "That's noted in the procedures," she said, though I'd read the rules several times and didn't remember anything about scheduled sounds at 2:47 a.m. "As long as you follow the rules, everything will be fine." I worked 4 more shifts that week. Each night, at exactly 2:47 a.m., the sound began. Each time, it lasted between 3 and 4 minutes. The acoustic sensors registered it consistently, but the system never classified it as an emergency. I started timing it precisely. 2 hours 47 minutes and 15 seconds to 2 hours 50 minutes and 58 seconds on Tuesday. 2 hours 47 minutes and 12 seconds to 2 hours 51 minutes and 3 seconds on Wednesday. Always starting within seconds of 2:47, always stopping before 2:52. On Friday night, during the sound event, I decided to step outside the trailer to get a better sense of where it was coming from. The rules didn't explicitly forbid leaving the trailer during sensor events, and I was curious whether the sound was audible from the exterior of the building. It was. Standing about 20 feet from the grain elevator's base, I could hear the metallic rhythm clearly. It seemed to be originating from the upper levels of the structure, maybe 60 or 70 feet above ground. The sound had a pattern: 3 quick beats, pause, 2 longer beats, pause, repeat. Like someone was operating machinery in a very specific sequence. If you're drawn to mysteries that don't have easy explanations, subscribing means you won't miss what happened next. That's when I noticed the light. A faint glow was visible through one of the small windows near the top of the elevator. It wasn't bright, but it was definitely there. According to Rule 3, I was supposed to record this observation but not investigate. I stood there for perhaps 30 seconds, watching the light flicker in sync with the metallic rhythm, then returned to the trailer to log what I'd seen. 2:47 a.m. Sound from elevator level 6 to 7. Duration 3 minutes 46 seconds. Light visible from exterior, approximately level 6. I hesitated before adding. Sound pattern consistent with manual operation. Saturday morning, Dorothy read my log entry twice before looking up at me. Manual operation? The rhythm isn't consistent with automated machinery, I explained. It has variations, pauses, changes in timing. Like someone is controlling it deliberately. Dorothy closed the log book. The facility has automated maintenance systems that operate on schedules determined by humidity and temperature conditions. What you're observing is normal facility operation. But I've been a chemistry teacher for 6 years. I knew the difference between automated processes and manual control. Automated systems maintain consistent rhythms, consistent timing, consistent outputs. What I was hearing had human characteristics, slight variations in tempo, occasionally skipped beats, patterns that suggested decision-making rather than programming. I started paying closer attention during my shifts. The temperature and humidity readings that I recorded every 2 hours showed patterns that correlated with the nightly sounds. Whenever the acoustic event occurred, humidity levels throughout the facility would drop by approximately 2% over the following hour. Temperature readings would fluctuate slightly, suggesting air circulation or movement within the elevator structure. More importantly, I began noticing that the motion sensors occasionally registered activity during the sound events. Not enough to trigger alerts, but enough to show that something was moving inside the facility. The activity always registered on sensors located on the upper levels of the grain elevator, in areas that should have been inaccessible due to the magnetic locks on the main entrance. 2 weeks into the job, I decided to research the facility's history. The Millerville Public Library had newspaper archives going back to 1962, and I spent a Saturday afternoon reading about Meridian Agricultural Holdings and their acquisition of the grain elevator property. The sale had been completed in August, 2 years earlier, following the death of the property's previous owner, a farmer named Robert Henley who had operated the facility for 34 years. What caught my attention was an article from September of the previous year, about 6 months after Meridian had purchased the property. The headline read, "Grain Elevator Renovation Project Suspended Following Workplace Incident." According to the article, Meridian had hired a construction team to modernize the facility's interior systems. Work had been suspended after a contractor named James Sullivan fell through a floor section on the 6th level of the elevator and was hospitalized with multiple injuries. What do you think was really happening in that grain elevator? Share your theories in the comments. The article mentioned that Sullivan had been working alone on a Saturday evening when the accident occurred. He'd been installing new ventilation equipment on the upper levels when a section of flooring gave way without warning. Sullivan survived, but required extensive surgery for injuries to his legs and back. Meridian settled with his family out of court and suspended all renovation work indefinitely. I found 2 more references to the facility in the archives. A brief mention in a business section article about Meridian's expansion into grain storage facilities, and a single paragraph in an agricultural report about harvest storage capacity in Jefferson County. Neither mentioned anything unusual about the property or its operations. But the timeline was interesting. Meridian purchased the property in August. Construction began in early September. The accident occurred in mid-September. Work was suspended. And according to the employment records Dorothy had shown me, the first security guard had been hired in October, about a month after the renovation project ended. That guard lasted 11 days. I was the 3rd person to hold this position in just over a year. Monday night of my 3rd week, I decided to test something. The rules specified that I should remain in the security trailer between 10 p.m. and 6 a.m. except for hourly perimeter checks or sensor alerts. But they didn't define what constituted a sensor alert. At 2:30 a.m., I created a minor disturbance by tapping on the exterior wall of the trailer, which triggered the motion sensors connected to the perimeter monitoring system. This gave me authorization to conduct an unscheduled perimeter check. Instead of following the standard clockwise route, I walked directly to the grain elevator and positioned myself at the base of the structure, as close as possible to the main entrance. At 2:47 a.m., the sound began as usual. But from this position, I could hear something I'd missed from the security trailer. Underneath the metallic rhythm, there was another sound. Human voices. Faint, but unmistakably people talking. The conversation was too distant and muffled for me to make out words, but the cadence and tone were clearly human speech. The light on the upper level was brighter than it had appeared from a distance. It wasn't the steady glow of electric illumination. It flickered and moved in ways that suggested flashlights or lanterns. During the 3 minutes and 51 seconds that the acoustic event lasted, I counted at least 3 separate light sources moving around inside the facility. When the sound stopped at 2 hours 50 minutes and 51 seconds, the lights disappeared immediately. The facility returned to complete darkness and silence. But I remained at the base of the elevator for another 10 minutes, listening carefully. At 3:03 a.m., I heard a single metallic click, like a latch being engaged, followed by the barely audible sound of footsteps on metal grating. Someone was inside the grain elevator. Someone was coming down. Hit that notification bell, because what happened next challenged everything I thought I knew about that place. I returned to the security trailer and documented everything in the log. Timestamps, duration, specific observations, my exact location during the event. When Dorothy arrived at 7 a.m., I handed her the log and waited to see how she'd respond to my detailed account of unauthorized personnel in the facility. She read the entry completely before speaking. "You were supposed to remain in the security trailer. I had sensor authorization for the perimeter check," I said. "Motion sensors triggered at 2:30 a.m. Dorothy looked at the monitoring logs, which would show the sensor activation I'd created. She spent several minutes cross-referencing my written log with the electronic records. Finally, she closed both documents and looked directly at me. "The facility operates under federal agricultural security protocols," she said. "Certain activities are classified and not subject to disclosure to temporary security personnel. Your job is to monitor and record, not to interpret or investigate." I asked what kind of classified activities required people to be inside a decommissioned grain elevator at 2:47 a.m. every night. Dorothy gathered her materials and walked toward her car without answering. But before getting in, she turned back toward me. Marcus, the previous guard, started asking similar questions. That's why we had to terminate his employment. The warning was clear enough, but I'd already crossed a line I couldn't step back from. I'd heard voices inside that building. I'd seen multiple light sources moving around areas that were supposed to be secured with magnetic locks. Whatever was happening at the grain elevator wasn't automated maintenance, and it wasn't authorized by any federal agricultural protocol I could imagine. That evening, I arrived at the facility with a different mindset. Instead of treating the security position as a temporary solution to my financial problems, I started thinking like the chemistry teacher I'd been for 6 years. I had observations that didn't match the official explanation. I had data that suggested someone was lying to me about the nature of this job, and I had access to the facility for 8 hours every night to gather more evidence. The first thing I did was examine the magnetic lock system on the main entrance more carefully. The locks were connected to a control panel inside the security trailer, with indicator lights that showed their status. Green meant locked and secure. Red meant malfunction or unauthorized access. Since starting the job 3 weeks earlier, I'd never seen anything but green lights. But I'd also never tested the system. At 11:30 p.m., I used the manual override switch to unlock the main entrance, waited 30 seconds, then engaged the locks again. The indicator light cycled from green to amber to red, then back to green. The system was functioning exactly as designed. If someone was entering the facility through the main entrance, the control panel should show it, unless they had their own access codes. I spent the next 2 hours reviewing every piece of documentation Dorothy had provided. The facility maps, the equipment manuals, the emergency procedures, the sensor specifications. Nowhere in any of these documents was there mention of authorized personnel conducting activities inside the grain elevator during overnight shifts. According to everything I'd been given, the facility was supposed to be completely unoccupied between 6 p.m. and 7 a.m. At 2:15 a.m., I positioned myself outside the security trailer with a clear line of sight to the grain elevator's main entrance. I wanted to see if the people I'd been hearing were entering through the front door or accessing the building through some other route. The main entrance remained closed and apparently locked throughout the entire acoustic event. But at 2:44 a.m., 3 minutes before the sounds typically began, I saw a brief flash of light near the base of the elevator. Not from inside the building, but from ground level, somewhere on the opposite side of the structure from where I was standing. At exactly 2:47 a.m., the familiar metallic rhythm began. This time, I walked around the perimeter of the grain elevator while the sounds were occurring, keeping track of where the noise seemed loudest and where I could detect the underlying voices I'd heard the previous night. If you've ever been in a situation where the official story didn't match what you were witnessing, you understand the choice I was facing. What I discovered changed my understanding of the entire situation. The sounds weren't coming from the upper levels of the grain elevator. They were coming from underneath it. The grain elevator sat on a concrete foundation that elevated the main structure about 4 feet above ground level. Walking around the perimeter during the acoustic event, I realized the metallic rhythm was loudest when I was standing directly next to the foundation. The voices were clearer there too, and when I knelt down and put my ear close to the concrete, I could hear what sounded like machinery operating in a space below the main building. There was a basement level that wasn't shown on any of the facility maps Dorothy had given me. The acoustic event ended at 2 hours 50 minutes and 43 seconds, and I returned to the security trailer to document my findings. But before I could complete the log entry, the emergency phone rang. It was Dorothy at 3:08 a.m. "Marcus, I need you to provide an immediate status report on all facility systems." I looked at the monitoring screens, which showed normal readings across all sensors. Everything appears normal. Green status on all monitoring equipment. Are you currently inside the security trailer? Yes. Have you left the trailer since beginning your shift? I hesitated, knowing that my honest answer would reveal that I'd been conducting unauthorized investigations of the facility. But something about Dorothy calling at 3 a.m. suggested she already knew what I'd been doing. I conducted a perimeter check during the scheduled acoustic event. There was a long pause. The scheduled acoustic event. The sound from the elevator that occurs every night at 2:47 a.m. I've been documenting it in the logs. Another pause. "Marcus, I need you to remain in the security trailer for the rest of your shift. Do not conduct any additional perimeter checks unless specifically authorized by me. I'll be at the facility in the morning to discuss your observations." The line went dead. I completed my log entry, but I didn't include my discovery about the basement level. Something told me that information needed to be kept separate from the official documentation. The rest of the shift passed quietly, but I couldn't stop thinking about Dorothy's phone call. How had she known I was outside the trailer at 3:08 a.m.? The security system didn't include GPS tracking of personnel, and there were no cameras monitoring the trailer's exterior. Unless someone had been watching me. What would you do if you discovered your employer was monitoring you without your knowledge? Let me know your thoughts. At 7 a.m., Dorothy arrived with a second person she introduced as Mr. Williams from Meridian Agricultural Holdings Corporate Security. Williams was younger than Dorothy, probably in his early 40s. and he carried himself with the kind of professional intensity that suggested either military or law enforcement background. Williams reviewed my log entries from the previous 3 weeks, while Dorothy operated the monitoring equipment. He paid particular attention to my documentation of the acoustic events, including the timing, duration, and my observations about the apparent human activity inside the facility. "You've been very thorough," Williams said finally. "Perhaps too thorough for the nature of this position." I asked what he meant by that. "Security work requires a balance between observation and discretion. You've been documenting phenomena that fall outside your assigned responsibilities. The sounds and lights are coming from inside a facility I'm supposed to be securing. How is that outside my responsibilities?" Williams exchanged a look with Dorothy before continuing. "The agricultural industry operates under various regulatory frameworks that require different levels of security clearance for different types of information. Some activities at this facility are conducted under federal oversight and are not subject to disclosure to contractors without appropriate clearances." I pointed out that no one had mentioned federal oversight or security clearances when I was hired. Williams nodded like he'd been expecting this response. "That's because your original assignment was routine security monitoring. But your detailed observations suggest you're encountering aspects of facility operations that weren't supposed to be visible during your shifts." Dorothy opened the manila folder she'd brought and pulled out a new document. "We'd like to offer you a position upgrade, enhanced security clearance, increased pay, and access to additional facility information. The new position comes with a comprehensive confidentiality agreement." The document was titled Enhanced Agricultural Security Position, Federal Contractor Status. The pay increase was substantial, from $18 per hour to $35. The confidentiality agreement was 8 pages long and included language about criminal penalties for unauthorized disclosure of classified agricultural research. "What kind of agricultural research requires people to work in the basement of a grain elevator at 2:47 every morning?" I asked. Williams smiled for the first time since arriving. "The kind that could revolutionize how we understand plant biology and food production. But only if it remains protected from industrial espionage and premature public disclosure." I read through the confidentiality agreement while Williams and Dorothy waited. The document was comprehensive and legally intimidating, but it also provided answers to questions I'd been developing over the past 3 weeks. The grain elevator facility was being used as a research site for something called Advanced Agricultural Biotechnology Integration. The research was conducted under contract with the Department of Agriculture and involved novel approaches to crop yield optimization. More importantly, the agreement acknowledged that research activities occurred on-site during overnight hours and that security personnel with enhanced clearance would be expected to assist with research operations as needed. "If I sign this," I said, "I'll learn what's actually happening here." "You'll learn what you need to know to perform your upgraded duties," Williams replied. "But Marcus, this decision is final. Once you sign, you're committed to the project for a minimum of 6 months. And the confidentiality requirements are permanent. If you want to know whether I signed that agreement and what I discovered in the basement of that grain elevator, subscribing means you won't miss the rest of this story." I thought about my situation. I was 3 weeks into a job that paid barely enough to cover rent and basic expenses. I had no prospects for returning to teaching, no other employment opportunities, and no clear plan for rebuilding my life after the divorce. The enhanced position offered financial stability and the answers to questions that had been keeping me awake during my days off. But I was also a chemistry teacher who had spent 6 years encouraging students to ask questions, challenge assumptions, and think critically about the information they were given. Signing a comprehensive confidentiality agreement felt like abandoning those principles. I signed the document. Williams immediately produced a key ring with 3 additional keys and a new set of rules typed on the same courier font paper as the original 8. The enhanced rules were more specific and considerably more complex. Rule 9, Williams read: Enhanced security personnel are authorized to access all facility levels during research operations. Rule 10. Research operations occur nightly between 2:30 a.m. and 3 a.m. Enhanced security personnel will assist research teams as directed by the project supervisor. Rule 11. All research materials, equipment, and data are classified. Photography, recording, or documentation by security personnel is prohibited except as specifically authorized by project leadership. Williams continued through 6 additional rules covering communication protocols, emergency procedures, and something called biological containment standards. The enhanced rules made it clear that my job was no longer passive monitoring. I would be directly participating in whatever was happening in the basement of that grain elevator. The project supervisor is Dr. Elena Vasquez, Williams explained. She'll meet you tonight at 2:30 a.m. to orient you to the research operations. After tonight, you'll be fully integrated into the project team. Dorothy and Williams left around 8 a.m., giving me time to review the new documentation and prepare for my first shift as an enhanced security contractor. I spent the day trying to research advanced agricultural biotechnology integration, but found virtually nothing in publicly available sources. The few references I could locate were brief mentions in federal budget documents and academic papers that had been heavily redacted. I arrived at the facility that evening with a mixture of anticipation and apprehension. For 3 weeks, I'd been speculating about what was happening inside the grain elevator. In a few hours, I would finally have answers. At 2:25 a.m., 5 minutes before the scheduled research operation, a woman emerged from what I had assumed was a maintenance shed near the grain elevator's north side. Dr. Elena Vasquez was in her early 50s, wearing lab clothing and carrying a tablet computer. She walked directly to the security trailer and introduced herself with the kind of professional efficiency that suggested she'd done this many times before. "You're the new enhanced security contractor," she said. It wasn't a question. "Marcus, I signed the agreement this morning." Dr. Vasquez checked something on her tablet. "Good. We can begin immediately. I'll need you to assist with specimen transport and environmental monitoring during tonight's research session." She led me to what I had thought was a maintenance shed. Inside, I discovered it was actually an elevator entrance. The shaft descended into the basement level I had identified through acoustic monitoring. Dr. Vasquez operated the elevator using a key card, and we descended approximately 20 feet below ground level. The basement was nothing like what I had expected. What do you think I found in that underground research facility? Share your predictions in the comments. Instead of a cramped storage area or maintenance space, the basement was a sophisticated laboratory complex that extended far beyond the footprint of the grain elevator above. The space was climate-controlled, well-lit, and filled with equipment I recognized from my chemistry teaching background: spectrophotometers, centrifuges, incubation chambers, and analysis computers. But there were also devices I didn't recognize: large cylindrical tanks filled with what appeared to be soil samples, growing chambers that seemed to simulate different environmental conditions, and along one wall, a series of transparent containers that held plants unlike anything I had seen before. "Advanced agricultural biotechnology integration," Dr. Vasquez explained, noting my expression. "We're developing crop varieties that can adapt to changing climate conditions, resist emerging plant diseases, and produce yields that exceed conventional agricultural projections." The plants in the transparent containers were remarkable. Some appeared to be corn, but with stalks that were nearly twice the normal height and ears that were proportionally larger. Others looked like wheat, but with grain heads that seemed to shimmer with an almost metallic quality. All of the plants appeared to be growing faster and more vigorously than anything I'd seen in conventional agriculture. "How is this possible?" I asked. Dr. Vasquez gestured for me to follow her to a workstation equipped with microscopes and sample analysis equipment. "We've developed a method for introducing beneficial genetic modifications through environmental conditioning rather than direct genetic manipulation. The plants adapt to specialized soil compositions and atmospheric conditions that enhance their natural growth processes." She showed me slides of plant cell structures that had been modified at the molecular level. The cells were larger than normal and contained organelles that didn't match standard plant biology. When I asked about the modifications, Dr. Vasquez explained that the research involved symbiotic biological integration. Essentially, the plants were forming partnerships with microorganisms that enhanced their growth capabilities. "Your job," she continued, "is to assist with environmental monitoring during our research sessions. We need precise measurements of temperature, humidity, atmospheric composition, and soil conditions throughout the growing process." For the next 25 minutes, I helped Dr. Vasquez collect data from the various growing environments in the laboratory. The work was straightforward and used skills I had developed during my chemistry teaching career. But I couldn't stop thinking about the implications of what I was seeing. If this research was successful, it could indeed revolutionize agriculture. Crops that could grow faster, produce larger yields, and adapt to climate change could address food security issues worldwide. But the secrecy surrounding the project, the federal involvement, and the basement location suggested there were aspects of the research that weren't being shared with me. At 2:55 a.m., Dr. Vasquez concluded the research session and escorted me back to ground level. "Same time tomorrow night," she said. "Your environmental monitoring data will be crucial for the next phase of the project." I returned to the security trailer and completed my log entry, documenting my first research assistance session in general terms that complied with the confidentiality requirements. But I also started a separate notebook where I could record my own observations about the research project. Something about the whole situation felt incomplete, like I was seeing only part of a much larger operation. Hit that notification bell because the deeper I got into this project, the more questions I had about what was really happening beneath that grain elevator. Over the next 2 weeks, I assisted Dr. Vasquez with nightly research sessions that followed a consistent pattern. We would descend to the laboratory at 2:30 a.m., collect environmental data from the growing chambers, monitor the plant specimens, and return to ground level by 3 a.m. Dr. Vasquez was professional, but not particularly communicative beyond what was necessary for the research work. However, I began noticing details that raised new questions about the project. The plant specimens were growing at rates that seemed to exceed even the optimistic projections Dr. Vasquez had described. Some of the corn plants had gained several inches of height between consecutive research sessions. The wheat varieties were producing grain heads that were becoming increasingly dense and apparently heavy. More concerning was something I observed during the 3rd week of enhanced security work. While collecting atmospheric data from one of the growing chambers, I noticed that the air composition readings were showing oxygen levels that were higher than normal atmospheric conditions. When I mentioned this to Dr. Vasquez, she explained that the modified plants were producing enhanced oxygen output as part of their improved photosynthesis processes. But we were working at night, in artificial lighting conditions that shouldn't have supported significant photosynthesis. And the oxygen levels I was measuring were high enough to create potentially hazardous conditions for human researchers working in the confined laboratory space. I started paying closer attention to the safety protocols in the laboratory. Dr. Vasquez wore specialized breathing equipment during our research sessions, but she had never provided similar equipment for me. When I asked about respiratory safety, she assured me that the exposure duration was too brief to create health risks. But I had been a chemistry teacher long enough to recognize when safety protocols weren't adequate for the working conditions. High oxygen environments combined with laboratory equipment created fire and explosion risks that should have required comprehensive safety measures. I began documenting these observations in my separate notebook, along with questions about other aspects of the research project. Why was the laboratory located in the basement of a grain elevator rather than at a proper research facility? Why were the research sessions limited to exactly 30 minutes each night? And why had no one mentioned that there were other research locations involved in the project? The answer to that last question came during my 4th week of enhanced security work. While collecting soil composition data from one of the growing chambers, I noticed a shipping label attached to a sample container. The label indicated that the soil sample had been transported from a facility in Brookfield, Pennsylvania, approximately 200 miles away. When I asked Dr. Vasquez about the Brookfield facility, she hesitated before explaining that advanced agricultural biotechnology integration was a multi-site research project. Different facilities were testing different aspects of the crop enhancement process under varying environmental conditions. How many sites are involved in the project? I asked. That information is classified above your clearance level, Dr. Vasquez replied. Your responsibility is limited to environmental monitoring at this facility. But her response raised a question I hadn't previously considered. If this was a multi-site federal research project involving classified agricultural biotechnology, why was I, a recently unemployed high school chemistry teacher with no security clearance background, being given access to sensitive research operations? The logical answer was that either the project wasn't as classified as they claimed, or my involvement served a purpose I didn't understand. I decided to test which possibility was correct. During my next research session with Dr. Vasquez, I asked technical questions about the plant modifications that went beyond basic environmental monitoring. I wanted to see how much information she would share with someone who supposedly had limited security clearance. The symbiotic organisms you mentioned, I said while recording soil pH levels, are they naturally occurring or artificially introduced? Dr. Vasquez looked up from the microscope she was operating. That's an excellent question. The organisms are naturally occurring, but we've developed methods for encouraging their integration with crop plants under specific environmental conditions. What kind of organisms? Primarily soil-based fungi and bacteria that form beneficial relationships with plant root systems, similar to mycorrhizal associations in forest ecosystems, but significantly more efficient at nutrient transfer. This was information that went well beyond what someone with basic security clearance should have access to. Dr. Vasquez was either violating security protocols by sharing technical details, or my clearance level was higher than I had been told. Are there any risks associated with the organisms? Dr. Vasquez paused in her work. All biotechnology research involves calculated risks. That's why we conduct controlled testing in isolated facilities before considering broader applications. What kind of risks? The symbiotic organisms are highly efficient at what they do. If they were introduced into uncontrolled agricultural environments, they could potentially outcompete native soil organisms. The ecological impact would be difficult to predict. I asked whether this was why the research was being conducted in basement laboratories rather than conventional agricultural settings. Dr. Vasquez confirmed that containment was a primary concern, but added something that surprised me. We're also testing the organism's behavior in different geological conditions. Basement laboratories allow us to control soil composition, groundwater interaction, and mineral content in ways that wouldn't be possible in surface-level facilities. This suggested that the research was more complex than enhanced crop production. If they were studying geological interactions, the project might have implications for soil management, groundwater systems, or environmental remediation. But it also raised questions about why they needed multiple research sites and why the timing of research sessions was so precisely controlled. Have you ever been in a situation where the more answers you got, the more questions you had? That's exactly what was happening to me. During my 5th week of enhanced security work, I made a discovery that changed my understanding of the entire project. While Dr. Vasquez was analyzing plant samples under the microscope, I was responsible for monitoring atmospheric conditions in the various growing chambers. One of the chambers was showing unusual readings, atmospheric pressure that was significantly lower than the other chambers and the laboratory environment generally. When I investigated further, I discovered that the chamber wasn't just maintaining different atmospheric conditions. It was connected to a ventilation system that extended beyond the laboratory complex. Following the ventilation ducting, I realized it connected to a network of underground passages that I hadn't previously known existed. During a moment when Dr. Vasquez was focused on her microscope work, I followed one of the passages approximately 50 feet from the main laboratory. What I found was a second laboratory space that was larger and more sophisticated than the area where I had been working. This second laboratory contained equipment I didn't recognize. Large metallic devices that hummed with electrical activity, growing chambers that were significantly larger than anything in the main lab, and plant specimens that were unlike anything I had seen before. Some of the plants appeared to be standard agricultural crops, but others seemed to be entirely new species. More importantly, there were people working in the second laboratory. I could hear voices and see lights from laboratory equipment operating. Dr. Vasquez had told me that research sessions were limited to her work with environmental monitoring, but clearly there were other research teams conducting simultaneous operations. I returned to the main laboratory before Dr. Vasquez noticed my absence, but I couldn't stop thinking about what I had discovered. The project was significantly larger than I had been told, involved multiple research teams working in parallel, and included plant specimens that went beyond enhanced versions of conventional crops. At the end of the research session, I asked Dr. Vasquez about the other research teams. Other research teams? I heard voices from other areas of the laboratory complex during tonight's session. Dr. Vasquez gathered her equipment without responding immediately. Finally, she said, "Advanced agricultural biotechnology integration involves multiple research components. Your clearance provides access to environmental monitoring operations. Other aspects of the project are compartmentalized for security reasons." What other aspects? That information is classified above your clearance level. But I was beginning to suspect that the classification levels were more flexible than Dr. Vasquez claimed. If the project required strict compartmentalization, why was I working in a facility with multiple research teams? And why were the security protocols inconsistent with the level of secrecy the project supposedly required? The next morning, instead of going home after my shift, I decided to research the property records for the grain elevator facility more thoroughly. At the Jefferson County Recorder's Office, I discovered that Meridian Agricultural Holdings had purchased not just the 43 acres where the grain elevator was located, but an additional 112 acres of adjacent farmland. More significantly, the property purchase had included mineral rights and something called subsurface development authorization. This suggested that Meridian's plans for the property extended beyond surface-level agricultural research. I also found building permits that had been filed for agricultural research facility infrastructure improvements 6 months after Meridian purchased the property. The permits covered construction work that was significantly more extensive than what would be required for grain elevator renovations. According to the documentation, the improvements included foundation work, electrical system upgrades, ventilation system installation, and specialized laboratory construction. The timeline was revealing. Meridian purchased the property in August. They filed for extensive construction permits in September. The contractor accident occurred during construction work in mid-September, but construction had continued after the accident, completing in February, 2 months before I was hired for the security position. This meant that the laboratory complex I was working in had been operational for only about 2 months when I started the job. I wasn't being brought into an established research project. I was participating in something that was still in its early stages. If this story is making you question what other research projects might be hidden in plain sight, a quick like helps others discover stories like this. During my 6th week of enhanced security work, I decided to test the boundaries of my access to the laboratory complex. Instead of limiting my environmental monitoring to the main laboratory where Dr. Vasquez conducted her research, I began exploring other areas of the underground facility during our 30-minute research sessions. What I discovered was that the basement complex was much larger than I had initially realized. The laboratory space extended in multiple directions from the grain elevator, covering an area that was probably larger than the surface facility. There were at least 6 separate laboratory areas, each focused on different aspects of plant research. In one area, researchers were working with what appeared to be root systems that had been separated from their plants. The roots were being maintained in specialized growing medium and monitored with equipment that measured electrical activity. When I asked one of the researchers about this work, she explained that they were studying bioelectrical communication patterns in enhanced root networks. Another laboratory area contained growing chambers that were significantly larger than anything in Dr. Vasquez's section. The chambers contained what looked like small ecosystems, soil, plants, insects, and what might have been small animals. The researchers in this area were studying how the enhanced crops interacted with other biological systems. The most interesting discovery was a laboratory area that contained historical specimens. According to the labeling, these were plant samples that had been collected from various locations over the past 2 years. Some of the locations I recognized from my research. Brookfield, Pennsylvania was represented, along with sites in Ohio, Indiana, and Kentucky. But there were also specimens from locations I hadn't expected, urban areas including Cleveland, Pittsburgh, and Cincinnati. If this research project was focused on agricultural biotechnology, why were they collecting plant specimens from cities? I asked Dr. Vasquez about the urban specimens during our next research session. Urban plant studies help us understand how enhanced crops might perform in different environmental conditions, she explained. City environments provide unique challenges: air pollution, soil contamination, limited growing space. If we can develop crops that thrive in urban conditions, we can contribute to food security in densely populated areas. This made sense, but it also suggested that the research project had goals beyond rural agricultural enhancement. They were developing crops that could potentially be grown in any environment, including locations that weren't traditionally considered suitable for agriculture. Are you planning to test these crops in urban environments? Dr. Vasquez hesitated before answering. Testing protocols are determined by project leadership based on research results and regulatory approval. My role is focused on the laboratory research phase, but her hesitation suggested that field testing was definitely part of the project timeline. And if they were planning to test enhanced crops in urban environments, the potential impact of the research was much larger than I had understood. I began documenting these observations in greater detail, including maps of the laboratory complex, descriptions of the different research areas, and notes about the researchers I encountered during my explorations. I also started recording the conversations I overheard, which provided insights into aspects of the project that Dr. Vasquez wasn't sharing with me. From these conversations, I learned that advanced agricultural biotechnology integration was being conducted under a federal contract that had a specific timeline for completion. The laboratory research phase was scheduled to conclude within 3 months, followed by controlled field testing at multiple locations. More importantly, I learned that the enhanced crops weren't just growing faster and producing larger yields. They were also more resistant to environmental stressors than conventional crops, including drought, extreme temperatures, and soil contamination. This meant that the crops could potentially be grown in locations that were currently unsuitable for agriculture. If you're fascinated by the implications of what I was discovering in that underground research facility, subscribing means you won't miss how this story concludes. During my 7th week of enhanced security work, my access to the laboratory complex changed dramatically. Instead of working only with Dr. Vasquez during the standard 30-minute research sessions, I was assigned to assist multiple research teams throughout the night. My shifts were extended from 8 hours to 10 hours, and my responsibilities expanded to include sample transport, equipment maintenance, and data analysis support. The expanded access gave me a comprehensive understanding of the research project's scope and objectives. Advanced agricultural biotechnology integration wasn't just about developing enhanced crops. It was about creating a complete agricultural system that could operate in environments that were currently unsuitable for conventional farming. The researchers were developing not just enhanced plants, but enhanced soil organisms, specialized growing techniques, and environmental monitoring systems that could support agriculture in locations ranging from urban areas to contaminated land to regions affected by climate change. But they were also developing something else: methods for rapid deployment of the enhanced agricultural system. The research included studies of how quickly the symbiotic organisms could establish themselves in new environments, how efficiently the enhanced crops could adapt to different soil and climate conditions, and how effectively the complete system could outcompete native plant and soil ecosystems. This last aspect of the research was what concerned me most. The enhanced agricultural system wasn't just more efficient than conventional farming. It was designed to dominate whatever environment it was introduced to. The symbiotic organisms were highly aggressive at acquiring nutrients and establishing territory. The enhanced crops grew so rapidly that they could outcompete native plant species for sunlight and growing space. If this system were introduced into natural environments, it could potentially transform entire ecosystems within a single growing season. I shared these concerns with Dr. Vasquez during one of our research sessions. All biotechnology research involves environmental considerations, she replied. That's why we conduct extensive laboratory testing before considering any field applications. But the research suggests that the system is designed to dominate existing ecosystems. What happens to native plant species and soil organisms? Dr. Vasquez stopped her work and looked directly at me. Marcus, you're asking questions that go beyond your responsibilities as enhanced security personnel. Environmental impact assessment is handled by specialists with appropriate expertise and clearance levels. I'm a chemistry teacher. I understand ecosystem interactions and environmental impacts. You were a chemistry teacher. Now you're a security contractor working on a classified federal research project. Your job is to assist with environmental monitoring, not to evaluate project outcomes or implications. Her response was clear. I was expected to participate in the research without questioning its broader implications. But as someone who had spent 6 years teaching students to think critically about scientific processes, I couldn't simply accept that the research was safe and appropriate because federal authorities said it was. That night, I decided to document everything I had learned about advanced agricultural biotechnology integration. I spent 3 hours after my shift writing detailed descriptions of the laboratory complex, the research methods, the plant and organism specimens, and the conversations I had overheard about field testing plants. I also researched the legal and regulatory frameworks that govern biotechnology research. What I found was concerning. The research was being conducted under agricultural security provisions that provided significant exemptions from standard environmental review processes. The Federal Contract Authority allowed testing of experimental biotechnology in controlled conditions without comprehensive environmental impact assessment. More importantly, the research was classified in ways that limited external oversight and public disclosure. Even if the enhanced crops posed environmental risks, those risks might not become apparent until field testing was already underway. If you discovered that a research project you were involved in might pose environmental risks, what would you do? Share your thoughts in the comments. During my 8th week of enhanced security work, something happened that forced me to make a decision about my continued participation in the research project. While assisting with sample transport in one of the secondary laboratory areas, I overheard a conversation between 2 researchers about the timeline for field testing implementation. According to what I heard, field testing was scheduled to begin within 6 weeks at locations in Pennsylvania, Ohio, and Indiana. The testing would involve introducing the enhanced agricultural system to controlled plots of farmland to evaluate performance under real-world conditions. But the conversation also revealed that the controlled plots were actually working farms where the enhanced crops would be grown alongside conventional crops without the knowledge of the farm owners or local communities. The field testing was designed to appear like normal agricultural operations while actually testing experimental biotechnology that could potentially affect entire regional ecosystems. When I asked Dr. Vasquez about the field testing protocols during our next research session, she refused to discuss the topic. Field testing procedures are classified above your clearance level and beyond your responsibilities. But if the testing involves working farms, shouldn't the farm owners know they're participating in experimental biotechnology research? Dr. Vasquez gathered her equipment and ended the research session 20 minutes early. "Marcus, I need to speak with Mr. Williams about your questions and concerns. Your role in this project may need to be reevaluated." The next morning, Williams arrived at the facility with Dorothy and a third person he introduced as Dr. Janet Morrison from the Department of Agriculture. They requested a comprehensive review of my enhanced security work, including examination of all documentation I had created during my time with the project. I provided the official log entries and environmental monitoring data I had prepared for Dr. Vasquez. But I didn't mention the separate notebook where I had documented my observations about the research project's scope and implications. "Your work has been excellent," Dr. Morrison said after reviewing my documentation. "Your environmental monitoring data has been crucial for several aspects of the research. We'd like to offer you a permanent position with the project, including relocation to our primary research facility and promotion to senior environmental monitoring specialist." The offer was attractive: significant salary increase, federal benefits, housing assistance, and the opportunity to work on cutting-edge agricultural research. But it also meant deeper involvement in a project that I was increasingly concerned might pose environmental risks. "Where is the primary research facility?" "That information will be provided after you accept the position and complete additional security clearance procedures." Williams handed me a new employment contract that was substantially more complex than the confidentiality agreement I had signed 2 months earlier. The new contract included language about permanent federal contractor status, indefinite project assignment, and comprehensive lifestyle security requirements. Reading through the contract, I realized that accepting the permanent position would essentially mean giving up my independence to become a full-time participant in whatever advanced agricultural biotechnology integration was planning to accomplish. "I need time to consider this offer," I said. Dr. Morrison looked at Williams, then back at me. "Marcus, this offer represents an unusual opportunity for someone with your background, but it's also time-sensitive. We need a decision within 24 hours. That afternoon, I drove to the Jefferson County Public Library and spent several hours researching federal biotechnology research programs, environmental impact assessment requirements, and whistleblower protection laws. What I learned convinced me that my concerns about the research project were justified. Federal biotechnology research was subject to environmental review requirements that didn't appear to be met by advanced agricultural biotechnology integration. Field testing of experimental crops was supposed to involve comprehensive community notification and environmental monitoring that wasn't part of the project timeline I had observed. More importantly, I found references to previous biotechnology research programs that had been terminated due to unexpected environmental consequences. Experimental organisms had escaped controlled testing environments, affected local ecosystems, and required expensive remediation efforts. Advanced agricultural biotechnology integration had all the characteristics of a research program that was prioritizing rapid development and deployment over comprehensive safety evaluation. Hit that notification bell because the decision I made next changed everything about my relationship with this project. I decided not to accept the permanent position. Instead, I submitted my resignation from the enhanced security contractor role, effective immediately. In my resignation letter, I stated that I was pursuing other career opportunities and thanked the project leadership for the learning experience. But I also made a copy of all my documentation about the research project, including my separate notebook with observations about the laboratory complex, research methods, and field testing plans. I sealed this documentation in an envelope and stored it in a safe deposit box at Jefferson County Community Bank. Williams called me 6 hours after I submitted my resignation. "Marcus, I understand you've decided not to continue with the project. Can you tell me what influenced this decision? I'm interested in returning to education. I've been offered a teaching position that starts in the fall." This wasn't true, but it was a plausible explanation for leaving a well-paying research position. "I see. Well, I hope that works out well for you. Just remember that the confidentiality agreement you signed remains in effect indefinitely. We trust that won't be an issue." The call ended, and I never heard from Williams, Dorothy, or Dr. Vasquez again. I returned to substitute teaching that fall, eventually finding a permanent position at a different school district. The grain elevator facility was sold to another agricultural company 6 months later, and the new owners converted it back to conventional grain storage operations. But sometimes, driving past farmland in Pennsylvania or Ohio, I noticed crops that seemed to be growing unusually well, producing yields that look higher than what conventional agriculture should support in those soil and climate conditions. I stop the car and examine the plants more closely when I can, looking for signs of the modifications I learned to recognize during my time in that underground laboratory. I've never found definitive evidence that the enhanced agricultural system was deployed in the field testing they planned. But I also know that absence of evidence isn't evidence of absence. The research I participated in was designed to integrate seamlessly with existing agricultural operations to appear normal even when it wasn't. The envelope in the safe deposit box remains sealed. I check on it twice a year, making sure the documentation is still secure and complete. I'm not sure what I would do with that information if I ever needed to use it, but having it feels important. Some discoveries change how you see the world around you, and once you know what to look for, you can never really stop looking.